My husband was in the backyard raking leaves when his phone lit up on the kitchen counter. I wasn't snooping. I never had been in 38 years of marriage. I was simply standing at the sink, rinsing the last of the dinner dishes when the screen flashed, and the words stared back at me before I could look away. Last weekend was everything. I keep thinking about you. I set down the glass I was holding, very slowly. The way you set something down when your hands have gone completely numb. Outside, through the window above the sink, I could see him. He was wearing the green fleece I bought him 2 Christmases ago, the one he always complained made him look like a park ranger. He was raking the maple leaves into a pile at the edge of our lawn in Barhaven, the same lawn we'd seeded together the summer we moved in, the same neighborhood where we'd raised 2 children, where I'd planted perennials along the front walk that came back every May without fail. He looked, from where I stood, like a perfectly ordinary 66-year-old man living a perfectly ordinary life. I had suspected for 6 weeks, not because of anything dramatic. It was smaller than that. A changed passcode on his phone, the way he'd started tilting the screen away from me at dinner, a charge on the Visa statement from a restaurant on Elgin Street on a Tuesday night when he'd told me he was working late at the office. I hadn't confronted him. A woman my age who has survived a mastectomy, raised 2 teenagers through the Ottawa winters, and outlasted 3 rounds of federal government restructuring does not panic at the first sign of trouble. I had waited. I had watched. And now, on a quiet Thursday evening in October, the answer had come to me without my even looking for it. I picked up his phone. The passcode was our son's birthday. He hadn't changed it from the old one, which meant some part of him, however small, was still careless enough to believe I would never check. I opened the message. The name at the top was listed simply as C, no last name, but the conversation was right there, weeks of it, scrolling upward in a long, careful thread. Dinner plans disguised as work coordination. Good morning texts. That had nothing to do with any project I'd ever heard him mention. A photograph she had sent him that I will not describe here. Enough. I stood in my kitchen for a long moment. The smell of the pot roast I'd made for dinner was still hanging in the air. I had put it in the slow cooker at 10 that morning, cut the carrots the way he liked, added the rosemary from the little pot on the windowsill. 38 years of small gestures exactly like that one. My heart didn't break. It had already been fracturing quietly for weeks, hairline cracks spreading beneath the surface. What I felt in that moment was something colder and more useful than grief. It was clarity. I scrolled back to the most recent message. Last weekend was everything. I keep thinking about you. She had sent it 40 minutes ago. He hadn't read it yet. I thought about what I knew. She worked at his firm. She was in her mid-30s. I'd gathered that much from the careful way he'd mentioned her once or twice in passing, always with that slightly too casual tone men use when they're trying to make someone sound unimportant. She had been with the company less than a year. I read her message one more time. Then I typed a reply. You should come by. My wife's visiting her sister in Kingston this week. I have the house to myself. I pressed send. I watched the 2 blue check marks appear. Then I put the phone back exactly where it had been, at the same slight angle, face down the way he always left it. I dried my hands on the dish towel. I went to the hall closet and took out the extra throw blanket, arranged myself on the living room sofa with a book, and waited. My husband came inside 20 minutes later, stomping the leaves off his boots in the mudroom, calling out that it was getting cold out there, that we'd have frost by the weekend for sure. Did I want him to bring in more firewood? I told him that would be lovely. I heard him in the kitchen, heard the small silence when he checked his phone, heard nothing further. He brought in the firewood. He made himself a cup of tea. He sat in his armchair with the hockey game on low, the same way he had on 10,000 other evenings. He did not look at me any differently than he ever had. That was somehow the worst part of all of it. I lay awake that night, listening to him breathe. 38 years. The man who held my hand in the hospital the night our daughter was born, who drove through a February blizzard to get to my mother when she fell, who had stood in our backyard on our 25th anniversary and told me, with that lopsided smile of his, that he would choose me all over again. I wondered how long that man had been a performance and when exactly the real one had replaced him. I did not cry. I had already decided I wasn't going to. The following evening, I told my husband I had an errand to run and drove to Patricia's place in Westboro. Patricia has been my closest friend since we met at a prenatal class in 1986. She is a family law lawyer with her own practice on Laurier Avenue. She is also the sharpest person I have ever known in my life. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, the way she always does, her reading glasses pushed up on top of her head, her hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile. When I finished, she set the mug down and said 4 words. "You kept the statement?" I had. I had photographed it on my phone. I had also, while my husband was watching the game the previous night, opened his iPad, which was still logged into his iCloud, and taken screenshots of the entire conversation thread. Every message, every photograph, dates, times, all of it. Patricia nodded slowly. She told me I had more than enough, that when the time came we would be ready. But she also said something else. She said that before we filed anything, she wanted me to have what she called a clean accounting of the marriage assets, and that she had a few ideas about how to make sure everything was properly documented before he had any reason to start moving things around. We talked for 2 hours. When I left, I felt, for the first time, in weeks, like myself again. The reply came the next afternoon. I was home alone, sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop, when his phone buzzed on the counter. "What time?" "I can bring wine." I felt my stomach go tight. Some small, traitorous part of me had still been hoping she wouldn't respond, that she'd thought better of it, that there would be nothing to confirm. But there it was, 5 words, cheerful and entirely unaware. I typed back, 7. "Take the 416 to Strandherd. I'll text you the address." Then I sent her the address of our house. I put the phone down. I went upstairs and changed out of my house clothes into the dark wool blazer I wear to school board meetings. I did my hair. I put on my pearl earrings. Then I came downstairs and began to make tea. My husband arrived home at 6:10, the same time he always did, smelling of the cold in his office building. He called out hello, dropped his bag in the hall, asked what was for dinner. I told him I'd made soup. He went upstairs to change. We ate. We spoke about ordinary things. His pension review that was coming up, whether we should go to our daughter's for Thanksgiving again this year or host here, the frost on the windshield that morning. He asked if I'd heard from my sister. I said she was fine. I watched his face for any flicker of guilt and found nothing, not a single crack in the plaster. At 5 to 7, I told him I thought I heard something on the front porch and asked him to check. He gave me a mildly puzzled look, but he went. While he was at the door, I sat in my chair and picked up my book, and I breathed. The doorbell rang at 7:01. I heard the door open. I heard the silence that followed it, the kind of silence that has shape and weight to it. And then I heard him say, very quietly, "What are you doing here?" I stood up, walked to the front hall, and there she was. She was younger than I had imagined, even knowing what I knew. Pretty in an unfinished sort of way, the kind of prettiness that doesn't yet know what it will cost. She was standing on my front step holding a bottle of Ontario Pinot Grigio in one hand, and the other hand pressed flat against the doorframe as if she needed something to hold on to. She was wearing a caramel-colored coat I recognized from a boutique on Bank Street. She looked, in that first instant, like a woman who had just opened a door expecting one room and found herself standing in another country entirely. She looked at my husband, she looked at me, and then her face did something I will not soon forget. I stepped forward, past my husband, and smiled at her. I said, "Welcome." I told her I was so glad she'd made it. I said my husband had told me so much about her, which of course was not true, but I said it anyway, warmly, watching the color drain from her face as she tried to understand what was happening. My husband was frozen in the doorway. I could feel the heat of his panic from 2 feet away. I told her to please come in, that it was far too cold to stand on the porch. We were heading into November after all, and I stepped back to make room. She came inside. Of course she did, because she had no idea what else to do. I took her coat and hung it in the hall closet. I showed her into the living room. She walked like someone moving through water, her eyes darting between my husband and me, waiting for the scene she expected, the raised voice, the tears, the accusation. None of it came. I sat down in my chair. I gestured to the sofa, and she sat on the edge of it like a child in the principal's office. My husband came in last and stood for a moment in the doorway before I asked him pleasantly to please sit down. He sat. The fire was going. The lamps were on. It looked exactly like what it was, a comfortable living room in a well-kept house in a good neighborhood, a room full of 38 years' worth of accumulated life, photographs on the mantel. The quilt my mother made folded over the back of the sofa, the good rug we bought in Halifax on our 20th anniversary trip down the coast. I had put out 2 mugs of tea on the coffee table, one for my husband and one for myself. For her, I had set a paper cup, the kind from the stack we keep in the laundry room for the grandchildren when they visit. A small, flimsy thing with a faded blue stripe around the rim. I had filled it with tap water from the kitchen. She looked at it. Then at the 2 mugs of tea in proper ceramic with saucers. She understood immediately, the way intelligent people do, that nothing in this room was accidental. I asked her how the drive had been. She said fine. Her voice was barely a thread. I asked her if she found the Strandherd exit all right, that it could be confusing coming off the 416 if you didn't know the area. She said yes. She found it fine. My husband said nothing. He was sitting with his hands on his knees, and his eyes fixed somewhere on the middle distance, the posture of a man who has made a catastrophic miscalculation and is still trying to work out the dimensions of it. I picked up my tea. I asked her how long she had been at the firm. She said almost a year. I said that was wonderful, that it must be so good to be getting started, that these early years in a career were so formative, weren't they? And she nodded with the expression of someone nodding at gunpoint. Then I turned to my husband. I mentioned, in a bright conversational voice, that I'd spoken to our financial advisor that afternoon. I told him I'd asked her to pull together the full picture, the RRSPs, the pension entitlement, the equity in the house, all of it, because I thought it was time we got serious about our retirement plan. I said I'd been reading that a lot of couples in their mid-60s forget to account for asset splitting if something unexpected happens, and I wanted us to be thorough. I said we'd worked too hard to be careless. I felt him go still beside me. I told him our daughter had called too, that she wanted us to come for Thanksgiving, and that she'd mentioned she and her husband were thinking about buying a place up near the Rideau Lakes. Wasn't that exciting? And didn't he think it would be wonderful to have somewhere to take the grandchildren in the summer? Every word I said was a wall going up around him. I was describing the full architecture of his life, in front of the woman he had tried to bring inside it, and I watched her understand, piece by piece, that none of this was hers. The retirement savings, the daughter, the grandchildren, the Thanksgiving table, the cottage country plans, none of it. She reached for the paper cup on the table and picked it up with both hands. I looked at it briefly and said, "Oh, I should have offered you something warmer. It's such a cold evening. Would she like tea?" I'd have to put the kettle on again, but it was no trouble. I let my gaze rest on the paper cup for just a moment, before looking back at her face. She said no. She said the water was fine. I said, "Are you sure?" And I let the question sit there. She said she was sure. My husband cleared his throat. He tried to say something, some preamble to an excuse, and I looked at him, just looked at him, and he stopped. I asked her if she'd been with the firm long enough to see one of those performance reviews he oversaw each spring. I said I'd heard from him that they could be quite involved. I said he'd always taken his professional responsibilities very seriously, that it was one of the things I had always admired about him, his integrity at work. The word integrity fell into the room like a stone into still water. She set the paper cup down. It made almost no sound. It was so light. I asked my husband if he remembered the trip we took to Prince Edward Island for our 35th anniversary. I said I had been thinking about it lately, about the red sand and the lobster rolls and that terrible bed and breakfast that turned out to be wonderful. I said I thought we should go back. Maybe next summer, before the grandchildren were old enough to have opinions about where we went on family trips. He said yes. His voice was completely hollow. I said I thought so too. She was looking at her hands now. Her nails were painted a deep burgundy. They were very still in her lap, but I could see from the slight tension in her shoulders that she was holding herself together by the thinnest thread. I stood up and said I was going to get some water for myself. Would anyone like anything else? And she shook her head, and my husband said no, and I went to the kitchen. I stood at the counter for a moment. I breathed. I could hear the silence from the other room, thick and total, neither of them daring to speak. Good. I wanted them to sit in it. I wanted the room to press down on them with the full weight of what it was. I came back. I sat down. I picked up my tea. And then I said very calmly, still looking at the fire, it's the strangest thing. Last week, my husband left his phone on the counter and a message came in while he was outside. I saw it before I could look away. The message said, "Last weekend was everything. I keep thinking about you." The room went absolutely silent. I turned and looked at her directly for the first time since she'd sat down. I said, "I've been wondering ever since who sends a message like that to someone else's husband." And then I said, "I have to say, I'm a little surprised it was you. You seem like an intelligent woman. You must have known this house was occupied." Her face was white. Her lips moved without producing any sound. I said, "The reply you received. Come by. My wife's in Kingston." I sent that. I set it up myself because I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. She looked at my husband. He was staring at the floor. I said, "He didn't know either. So if you're waiting for him to rescue you, I wouldn't." She picked up her bag from beside the sofa, the movement automatic, the body doing what the mind couldn't organize. She said something about needing to go, about having gotten things wrong, about being sorry. The words came out in pieces, disconnected and useless. I stood up. I said, "Before you do." She stopped. I told her that I had screenshots of everything, every message, every photograph, the restaurant on Elgin Street, all of it. I told her that I also had documentation of several firm expense account entries that I suspected would be of interest to HR, entries my husband had submitted for business meals that appeared, based on the dates and the conversation record, to have been personal. I said I hadn't decided yet what to do with any of it, but that I wanted her to know that I had it, and that I intended to be very deliberate about my next steps. She left without another word. I heard her car start on the street. I heard it pull away. I stood in my front hall for a moment, then I turned around. My husband was standing in the entrance to the living room. He looked in that moment truly old. Not the comfortable age he'd been wearing for the past decade, the silver hair and reading glasses and the distinguished lines around his eyes. He looked diminished, smaller than I'd known him to be. He said my name, just once, the way you say something when you don't have anything to follow it with. I walked to the kitchen. I looked at the slow cooker on the counter. I had made a batch of soup that morning, the butternut squash one his mother used to make that he had always loved, the one that took 2 hours and smelled like warmth itself. I turned it off. I lifted the lid, looked at it for a moment, and then I poured it down the drain. He was in the doorway. I didn't look at him. I said, "What we had was like this soup, something I made carefully, for years because I thought it mattered. It doesn't survive this. Nothing does," he tried. He said everything that men say in those moments. That it meant nothing. That he had been foolish. That he would end it completely. Had already ended it. Had known it was a mistake from the beginning. He was sorry. He was so sorry. Please. I told him that I'd already spoken to Patricia. That she was my lawyer now. And that any communication regarding the house, the pension, the savings, or any other joint asset should go through her. I told him there were documents on the dining room table he should review at his earliest convenience. The documents were 2 things. One was a printed summary of all joint assets I had compiled over the previous week, every account, every investment, current valuations. The other was a letter from Patricia's firm, dated that morning, initiating the process of legal separation. He sat down at the dining room table with those papers, and I went upstairs and finished packing the bag I had been quietly assembling for 3 days. I drove to Patricia's. She was waiting with the lights on. Over the following 2 weeks, from the spare bedroom of her house in Westboro, I put together what needed to be put together. Patricia reviewed the expense account records and confirmed that there were grounds for a workplace complaint, which she helped me draft in clear, factual language. Not vindictive, not emotional. A simple, documented account of what had occurred, with supporting records attached. We sent it to the firm's managing partner and HR director only, no one else. The response was swift. An internal audit was opened. When the full picture became clear, my husband was asked to take an immediate leave of absence. Given his seniority and how close he was to retirement, the quiet departure they offered him was contingent on an agreement that minimized the public nature of the proceedings, which suited me. I didn't want a spectacle. I wanted it on record. His professional reputation had been everything to him. In certain circles in this city, it still followed him to dinners and board meetings and functions at the Rideau Club. That door closed without any drama, and in some ways, that was more complete than anything louder would have been. The asset division took several months. The house was in both our names, 31 years of mortgage payments behind us, and the equity was considerable. My husband wanted to stay in it. I understood why. It was the house. It held everything. But I had made him a fair offer through Patricia, and when he tried to negotiate me down, she simply laid out the complete financial picture, including the documentation we had prepared, and made clear that the alternative to an agreed settlement was a trial that would be considerably more thorough and considerably more public. He accepted the terms in the third month. The RRSP accounts were split according to the spousal rollover provisions. His defined benefit pension was divided at source. The house was sold that spring to a young family from Montreal who had been transferred to Ottawa and wanted to be in a good school district. They put in a strong offer and we accepted. On the day of closing, I stood on the sidewalk in front of it for a moment before getting into the car. The perennials were already coming up along the front walk, exactly as they always did. Every May, without fail. I did not look back as I drove away. The apartment I chose was smaller than I expected to want, on the second floor of a low-rise building near the glebe, with tall windows that looked out over a stretch of mature trees. Patricia came to help me arrange the furniture on moving day, and we ordered Thai food and sat on the floor eating it out of the containers because I hadn't unpacked any bowls yet, and we talked for 3 hours about nothing important, the way old friends do. My daughter called the following week. She had been careful with me throughout all of it, practical and loving in the way she has always been. She asked if I needed anything, if I was sleeping, if I wanted her to come down from Toronto. I told her I was all right, that I was in fact genuinely all right. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Mom, I know," and I believed her. I started volunteering 2 mornings a week at a literacy program at a library branch nearby. I'd spent 30 years as a public health nurse, and I had forgotten, in the busyness of the years that followed retirement, how much I needed to be useful. Within 3 months, they asked if I'd consider taking on a coordinator role. I said yes without having to think about it. One evening in January, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, the apartment quiet around me, in that good way, the trees outside the window lit by the streetlights. My phone showed a notification from an email newsletter Patricia subscribed to, a women's support community she'd shared with me. I had been reading it occasionally over the previous months, mostly late at night when sleep was elusive. There was a message in the community forum. A woman in her 50s, username withheld, had written a short post. She said she had read the story of someone who had been in a situation like hers and had found the clarity to leave, and that reading it had been the first time she'd understood that what she was living with was not something she had to keep living with. She said she had made an appointment with a lawyer. She signed it. Thank you. I sat with that for a long time. I don't know what the right word is for what I felt. Not triumph, not vindication exactly, something quieter than either of those. The sense that the worst year of my life had, somehow, without my planning it, become useful to someone I would never meet. I put the phone down. I looked out at the trees. The branches were bare, the way they are in January in this city, but I know this neighborhood now. I know that by April, they will be green again. My name is Diane. I am 63 years old. I live alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Glebe in Ottawa, and on Sunday mornings, I walk to the farmer's market and buy bread and tulips and have a coffee from the cart near the entrance, and I stand in the thin winter light and breathe the cold, clean air, and I think, yes, this is mine, all of it. It took me 38 years and one lit-up phone screen on a Thursday evening in October to understand that the life you deserve is not always the one you're already living. Sometimes you have to walk out the door and let it build itself around you, and trust that the perennials will come back in May, and the trees will green again in April, and the woman you were before all of it, the woman who is still entirely intact beneath everything that was done to her, has been waiting patiently this whole time for exactly this. She has. I promise you, she has. Did this story speak to you? I'd love to hear which part stayed with you, and where in the world you're listening from. Leave a comment below. If this resonated, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it today. There are 2 more stories on your screen right now that I think you'll find just as powerful. Stay with me. There is always more to tell.